Good evening. I'm Amy Ng, Associate Curator here at the Frick, and co-curator of Moroni, The Riches of Renaissance Portraiture, which will be closing in just a few weeks on June 2nd. Welcome to all of you joining us here tonight at the Frick, and also to those many of us who love to use the Frick's webcast during the show and afterward. This is the final lecture given in conjunction with the Moroni exhibition. Unfortunately, we had to reschedule Jane Bridgman's lecture on Moroni and fashion, Moroni and dress, for the fall. But please mark your calendars. Jane Bridgman will be giving a lecture on Renaissance fashion, including Moroni and some of the Frick's permanent collection Renaissance portraits, on the 11th of September, coinciding with New York Fashion Week. We'll also be holding a panel about representation in art, entitled Who's Not in the Picture? That will be on June 2nd, the final day of this exhibition. My thanks to all of my colleagues at the Frick who have made tonight possible, especially Persephone Allen. And I ask that you please silence your phones. And the Moroni exhibition will remain open after the lecture for 30 minutes. As many of you know, Giovanni Battista Moroni was not particularly famous in his own time or in modern art history, especially outside of Italy. So it's been a pleasure to witness the rise of Moroni in America as his name has graced the pages of major newspapers and television, radio, and all over the internet. To hear his name on the lips of Frick visitors who meet him for the first time here in the galleries, indeed to see his man in pink on subway platforms all over New York City. In addition to introducing American audiences to Moroni, one of the main objectives of our exhibition was to show that he was a more interesting artist than he has traditionally been seen. He was not just a documentarian, a copyist of his sitters and their things, but more creative, playful even, more complex. Tonight's lecture probes Moroni as a painter whose art is much more than a record of people in provincial cities on the western frontier of the Venetian Republic. Tonight's speaker explores new depths of Moroni's portraiture by turning attention to Moroni's spaces, the backgrounds against which we experience his sitters, grounds and backgrounds observed or imagined as significant sites of creative potential. It's an honor to introduce Dr. David Young Kim, Associate Professor in the History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania and simultaneously visiting lecturer at the University of Zurich. A specialist in Italian Renaissance art and beyond, he has published and lectured extensively around the world. His celebrated book, The Traveling Artist in the Italian Renaissance, Geography, Mobility, and Style, published in 2014 through Yale University Press, derived from his dissertation, for which he earned his PhD at Harvard University. The Traveling Artist, by the way, was a finalist for the Ralph Waldo Emerson Book Prize. He has published on topics as widely ranging as cartographic images of the New World, the horror of realistic images, cross-cultural exchange in the Mediterranean, the reception of Gentile Bellini's sojourn at the Ottoman court, and architectural representation. And I will note his important and provocative study on the Frick's own Bellini, St. Francis. His edited volume, Matters of Weight, Force, Gravity, and Aesthetics in the Early Modern Era, published 2013, examines the theory and exploration of weight as an aesthetic category in works of art. Literally, it was one of the heaviest books on my shelf, until the recent publication of the Frick's own catalog of the Schurr collection of commemorative medals, which just came out this month. Among Dr. Kim's abundant scholarly articles and books, I'll also point out that he was invited to write a peer-reviewed, nearly 10,000-word essay for the Grove Dictionary of Art, Oxford Art Online, which is the standard art history reference source online, on a topic no less daunting than the Renaissance, And it is now one of the top 10 essays consulted in the Grove Dictionary of Art Online, with thousands of hits per year. And I'm happy to know that around the world there are thousands of people looking up the Renaissance every year. In addition to Dr. Kim's extraordinary scholarly accomplishments, he is a beloved and inspiring teacher. I've seen him in action with his students, encouraging them to push ideas further with courage and caution, to look at art sensitively, at painting as a whole object, down to the very panel or canvas on which it is painted, to think deeply and passionately, and to know primary sources inside out at the same time, to have confidence in the artist and in the work of art. In all of this, he leads by example. Dr. Kim's lecture tonight is entitled Moroni's Gray Grounds. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was such a magisterial and moving introduction. I won't forget it. Before I begin, I'd like to extend my warm thanks to Persephone Allen, Gemma McElroy, and especially, again, to Amy. Many of my thoughts on Moroni attempt to establish a dialogue with this important catalog written by Amy Ng and the co-curator of the exhibition, Simone Facchinetti. But before turning to Moroni, let me begin with a voice familiar to all of us at the Frick, namely the American novelist Edith Wharton. So in 1905, Wharton published her travelogue, Italian Backgrounds. And although we might not think of Wharton as an art historian, she was well acquainted with the old masters, a passion she shared with her friend, the art historian Bernard Berenson. And Wharton, as an astute chronicler of New York society, whose life revolved around Washington Square, applied her powers of observation to Renaissance painting. And in this book, she has a very provocative passage. She writes, quote, "In the Italian devotional pictures of the early Renaissance, there are usually two quite unrelated parts, the foreground and the background. The foreground," Edith Wharton says, "is the place of the conventional, where we encounter, as she puts it, the usual saints, angels, and holy family. By contrast," she says, "the background is where," and these are her words, "is where the artist really expresses himself. It is there that we find the real picture, the picture which had its birth in the artist's brain." End of the quotation. And in the so-called Madonna of the Meadow by Bellini, just to take an example, we can imagine that visual interest lies not only in the figures in the foreground, the conventional subject matter, but obviously in the fields, fortified hills, and the ominous vulture sitting in the tree to the upper left-hand side of the Virgin. Now, Wharton ultimately employs the metaphor of foreground and background to make a distinction between the tourist site and the hidden destination, between the conventional sightseer and the informed erudite traveler. Nevertheless, her observation that the background is where originality resides shows how we usually privilege, in fact, figure over ground. But tonight I'd like to ask with all of you, what would art history look like if we diverted our attention momentarily to the ground? And by ground, I'm referring to three semantic areas of the picture. First, ground as the material preparation of the support, ground as pavement or earth, and finally, the background of the Renaissance picture. How might we write a history of the Renaissance picture from this inverted perspective? Now, ancient vignettes about the origins of painting notably involve the ground and in the form of the wall. The ancient Roman Pliny the Elder attributes the discovery of painting to the act of tracing a line around the shadow of a beloved. The daughter of a potter from Corinth falls in love with a young man about to depart for a journey. And when he was going abroad, Pliny recounts, the maiden drew an outline on the wall of the shadow of his face as thrown by the lamp. Here, painting as a medium comes into being through certain physical conditions. First of all, a ground. And this ground takes the form of a wall, the wall on which the Corinthian maiden draws around her beloved's shadow. But the wall isn't simply the backdrop for this story. It's a place of tension. It's a place of tension that stands on the edge between domestic interior and distant destination, between the couple's shared physical presence and their reconstitution as two separate entities. On one hand, the observer, the daughter, and on the other, the absent sitter, the beloved. And while the lover will always carry his shadow with him like a personal attribute, the maiden will have the shadow on the wall. For his Florentine residence, the artist and biographer Giorgio Vasari painted a variation on this myth. And here it doubles as the beginning of self-portraiture. And to this, I would add that the wall, the monochromatic field, becomes the charged site where painting thinks about what it is by thinking about where it is. That is to say, on the limit of grasping and releasing the beloved. Now, I'd like to think about the problem of the wall, and more generally the ground, in the portraiture of Giovanni Battista Moroni. And the anecdote I just cited was, in fact, the beginning sentences, were the beginning sentences of the superb essay in the catalog essay, Moroni and the Invention of Portraiture by Amy Ng, who argues persuasively that instead of taking Moroni's naturalism at face value, we ought to see how this effect is, in her words, flexible and multifaceted, achieved through various pictorial modes. So my talk this evening attempts to take up this suggestion in the catalog by exploring a dimension in these portraits which seem completely negligible, namely Moroni's gray grounds. Now, a range of sitters, from poets to the northern Italian elite, inhabit Moroni's canvases. And the common denominator, as I've mentioned, in many of his paintings are his gray grounds. In his bust-length portraits, backgrounds are a field of gray surrounding sitters. Gray grounds feature in Moroni's longer portraits that emulate courtly portraiture. And in these three-quarter length portraits, gray grounds function as architectonic elevations that seem to hug and frame the body. In his full-length portraits, gray grounds are the walls and floors where these sitters stand. Gray grounds are a recurring theme. They rise, crumble, and when inscribed with words, speak to us, though their sitters remain mute. Now, scholars routinely dismiss these gray grounds as mere foils or formulae, that is to say, neutral planes of color that exist simply to set off the figure by means of contrast. I'd like to reverse this perspective, instead asking how we might diagnose the complex behavior of ground and propose something else. Namely, that Moroni's portraits, in Moroni's portraits rather, ground is not simply behind the figure or adjacent to it. Namely, ground permeates figure. Ground erupts through layers of paint to infiltrate the color and texture of the figure. And in addition to permeating the figure, I want to argue, ground becomes a type of prosthesis of the figure, by which I mean an extension of the figure. Simply put, these sitters exist in a state of dynamic interplay with their supporting structures. We usually think of the face where we can understand a person, and as the saying goes, the eyes are the windows to the soul. Or else we could identify somebody on the street through costume, gesture, or attribute. But Moroni dispenses with these cliches. On these walls, access to an inner life is hinted at, though not shown, suggested, though not fully revealed. We have what we might call walled figures or figured walls. The figure takes on properties of the wall, and the wall takes on properties of the figure. And the interaction between figure and wall works together to express in some way the psychic life of the sitter. Yet at the same time, the wall restricts complete access to this inner life. In other words, Moroni's gray grounds are unstable grounds, unstable materially, spatially, and emotionally. We might ask ourselves, what brought the first humans to form the first societies? Was it fire or water? The answer is neither, according to the Renaissance art theorist Leon Battista Alberti. Recalling the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius, Alberti states that it was the wall, not fire and water, that drew and kept men together. And to describe the first human settlement structured by walls, Alberti uses two very interesting terms. One is contenere, literally to hold with, that is to say contain, and conciliare, that is to say call together or congregate. Without taking Alberti's words too literally, we might nonetheless use them to characterize the wall in the Renaissance picture. The wall acts as what we might call contingent containment. By this I mean it contains the body, keeping it within bounds. The wall becomes a marker of culture and a place of display. The wall is where a society says to itself and others, people live here. It encloses the figure defensively, limiting view beyond its confines. At the same time, however, this containment is contingent. Despite its association with human settlement, the wall can also be transitory. The figures can move away from the wall, or else the wall can crumble away, alluding to the future of oblivion or the elemental past. Now, the wall's dual nature has much to do with the color of Moroni's grounds, namely their grayscale. Ground has an uncertain position on the chromatic scale. It's able to oscillate between brilliance and dullness. As a mixture of white and black, gray can both absorb light, but it can reflect it too. And in the vernacular of Renaissance Italy, different words attempted to grasp the shades of gray. Grigio, gray, cinereo, ash-colored, plumbeo, lead, berrentino, a type of brown gray. And gray also spanned the spectrum of economic value. Franciscans adhering to their vow of poverty were humble robes that were a colorless brown gray. But true gray was a prestigious color. It was difficult to achieve in the dyeing process, and therefore had to come in the form of such expensive materials as fur. The Italian word vaio, vert in French, or minever in English, refer to the color of squirrel fur, a variegated white, bluish, and gray type of fur, and the pattern where pelts were stitched together. And here I'm showing you an illuminated miniature that shows, in fact, this very interesting contrast between a friar with this brown, grayish cloak and this extremely luxurious minever fur lining that's not going to last too long as he's about to be executed. Now, gray is also the color through which Renaissance painters worked out the overlaps and distinctions between painting and the arts of sculpture, architecture, and other media. For example, in Parmigianino's Portrait of a Collector, dated to before 1524, gray ground acts as the chromatic field from which emerges the relief sculpture of Mars, Venus, and Cupid to your left. This is placed at a disjointed angle with the landscape painting, which also doubles as a distant view outdoors. the play between light and darkness, sets the effects of relief and spatial recession at odds with one another. The sculpture protrudes while the painting recedes, and the human figure serves as the hinge between the two. Both sculpture and landscape seem continuous with the gray wall. However, the distinctions and transitions between these medial zones are not easy to grasp at all. Gray can also describe a zone between space and non-space, between somewhere and nowhere. Take, for example, Titian's A Man with a Quilted Sleeve, and perhaps a portrait of the Venetian aristocrat Girolamo Barbarigo, dated 1510. Now, the painting's most projecting components include the gaze of the sitter, the texture of the magnificent cloth, and the parapet inscribed with Titian's initials, T and V, which you can see below. Yet also compelling is the portrait's gray ground. We might perceive this zone maybe as a solid wall, maybe as a fluctuating atmosphere, or maybe as a place of shadows. For some viewers, it might have even evoked the canvas support with a prepared ground. More than a mere foil, then, gray ground has a consistency. It holds the figure while remaining at the same time undefinable. Likewise, I'd like to suggest this evening, Moroni's gray grounds pass through chromatic, spatial, temporal, and especially affective states. And in so doing, they disclose how the artist might contain, yet not fully grasp, the figured self. Now, these gray grounds are in fact the uppermost strata that sit above layers of paint applied on canvas, which was Moroni's preferred material support. On canvas, Moroni first applied a layer of gesso, a mixture of white pigment and binder that would reduce the absorbency of that canvas support. This gesso ground would then be primed with another layer of drying oil combined with pigmentation. This priming layer, referred to in the sources occasionally as mestica, provided the foundation from which Moroni could work up both the color and texture of the picture. Technical analysis conducted by scientists at the National Gallery in London has shown that Moroni's primings tend to be thick brown layers which consist of yellow and red earths, manganese black, and lead white. And in the portrait of a man with raised eyebrows, the material makeup and physical application of the ground informs the appearance and affect of the sitter. The brownness beneath the gray, in the mestica layer, adds depth of hue, and more specifically, it brings the background closer, or rather the preparatory ground, closer to the chromatic composition of flesh and hair. This admixture provides Moroni with a point of departure to readily describe the man's facial features, not just his skin and beard, but his temples too, which pass from chestnut brown to gray. Gray ground brings the painting's superstrate and the painting's substrate together in service of portraying likeness. Ground permeates figure. What is more, this ground joins the face in conveying psychic movement. It acts like a curtain that, when lifted up, offers a glimpse into the artist's working process. Grounds are often painted first, and the figure with its details of the face are left in reserve, to be painted last. This follows a sequence from the illusionistic back to front. But in this picture, however, Moroni displays his tendency to do the opposite, to apply the gray ground late in the painting process, making it stop short of the outer limits of the sitter. As a result, the brown imprimatura emerges as a narrow margin around the sitter's ears, shoulders, and broad white collar. And I hope you can see both to the left and to the right how this brown imprimatura that's peeking through the gray background somehow functions as a supplementary contour, a second type of figural line. Moroni's swift laying of the ground parallels the moment when the sitter opens his eyes. Maybe he's expressing some skepticism at a remark just uttered. We might think, for example, of the American comedian Stephen Colbert and his famous raised eyebrow that has recently been memorialized as an emoji. But let's return to our own Renaissance Colbert. Perhaps Moroni's sitter is expressing both surprise and skepticism at what he feels, namely the brush that brushes against his collar as it makes his own image. And here it's interesting to think that the word tokko, or touch, can also refer to brushwork. Now, the raised eyebrow was a topos in physiognomy. And physiognomy, the classical body of learning, aimed, in Aristotle's words, to detect how the movements of the soul become revealed in the body. But here, the raised eyebrow does more than convey the sitter's skepticism. The eyebrow also corresponds to the lifting up of the gray ground, like a curtain. The face itself comes to express Moroni's prestezza, the handling of the brush, which is paradoxically rough and dexterous. Although this gray ground appears to enclose and embrace the sitter, it in fact reacts to the sitter. Moroni disturbs the stratified layers of paint that enclose the figure. He shakes them up to picture a kinetic mode of feeling. And this interplay between sitter and wall, what I've termed contingent containment, also transpires in portraits organized around bodies and buildings. One of Moroni's most common types of grounds consists of the figure, either full or half-length, standing on a stone pavement and placed against walls, columns, and niches, often in ruins. An early example of this architectural ground is his portrait of a gentleman now in Milan. Moroni's teacher, Moretto, often included architectural backgrounds in his paintings. And we should also remember that Moroni's own father, Francesco Moroni, was active as both architect and stonemason. Yet Moroni's portraits show more than just a general understanding of classicizing architecture in 16th century Italy. He deploys architecture to meditate on the articulation of the human body. Articulation in the sense of the joining together of limbs, and articulation in the sense of formulating words and emotional expression. Moroni likens wall and sitter to the anatomical parts that come together to form a joint. But in times of duress, joints can snap out of place too. A portrait dated 1560 features the Spanish aristocrat Don Gabriel de la Cueva y Giron, the 5th Duke of Albuquerque and the Governor General of Milan. And we can see how Moroni articulates Gabriel's physical stance by joining limbs, head, attributes, and costume. But this construction of stance involves more than just the articulation of the figure, the coming together of joints. For Moroni draws a series of analogies between Gabriel's joints and the design of the wall, which somehow seems to offer an abstracted version of his body. Conversely, Gabriel's figure incarnates the features of this architectural interior. If put into words, these analogies might sound like this. Thigh is the hip as plinth is to ledge. Spine is the elbow as pilaster is to niche. And in Renaissance architectural theorists, in emulation of the ancients, indeed elaborated on the conventional description of proportions of a building in terms of body parts. Walls were compared to bones. A cornerstone could extend into a wall like an elbow. And Moroni, I would argue, extends this metaphor into the realm of portraiture. Consequently, the effects of Gabriel's stance move beyond the figure and reverberates in the surrounding architectural field. The wall's chromatic vibrancy is a case in point. Like in the portrait of the man with a raised eyebrow, the brownness beneath the gray approaches the coloring of flesh and hair. But the gray ground itself matches Gabriel's pale blue eyes, such that optically, Gabriel seems to be bound to the wall with his eyes, like a pair of nails. Wispy brushstrokes rise throughout the wall's gray expanse, taking on the aspect of distant clouds. They not only describe streaks on the wall, signs of wear and tear, they also align with Gabriel's facial features, as though wrinkles have escaped from his face to corrugate the wall. The adage written on the plinth develops this linkage between figure and wall. It reads, "Aquí estoy sin temor, y de la muerte no hay pavor." I am here without fear, and of death I have no dread. Such adages work as Rosalie Colli pointed out, thematic punctuation, summing up a massive experience into one charged phrase. Possibly a family motto, the adage might also refer to Gabriel's fortitude and the many conflicts he mediated in his capacities as a political appointee. And in the specific context of the portrait, the adage articulates Gabriel's stance by placing it into an affective register. It is interesting to note that unlike English, Spanish assigns two verbs, ser and estar, to express to be. Ser derives from the Latin esse, to be, while estar comes from stare, to stand. And while ser indicates existence or a type of fixed essence, estar describes dynamic states of being. So while ser is a territory of stable identity, estar has a more local and circumstantial sense, where the verb signifies being firm and upright, but ready to begin moving at the same time. I think these nuances between ser and estar bear directly on our understanding of Gabriel's motto. Because Gabriel not only asserts his fearlessness, he's not only not afraid of death, he stands fearless in the face of death, estar. But the use of estar also signals the possibility of disarticulation, because the figure prepared to act can snap out of place at any moment. Indeed, Gabriel can extract himself at any second from the stationary wall to draw his sword. Yet, the situation is even more complicated because the adage, in fact, guards Gabriel, concealing his emotional life. Because when we deny fear, we deny affect. The denial of fear is the denial of affect. And we encounter this adage on a pedestal where we might imagine Gabriel, who is standing like a statue, an image of fearlessness. But then the statue comes alive. He steps off the pedestal and leans on it, pausing to contemplate his relationship to his motto. Like the skeleton in Vesalius' Anatomy, whose motto reads, "Genius lives on, all else is mortal," who has become simultaneously the student and the cadaver, Gabriel descends from his base to enter a contemplative dimension of selfhood. Of course, Gabriel's costume is an aquifer of material sensuousness, as seen in the rippling layers of slashed leaves in the codpiece peeking out beneath the doublet. However, the difference between this graspable material presence and inner being, only appears in flashes before coalescing into the artifice of the portrait composed by joints. In the end, I think we really see nothing but a walled figure and a figured wall, two types of an impervious defensive enclosure. In the so-called Portrait of a Poet, Moroni pursues a variation on this analogy between body, architecture, and affect. And here, too, body corresponds to wall. The sitter's upright posture echoes the verticality of the gray stone pilaster and successive layers of brick. Hip coincides with the pedestal, and even the bending of the joints and his fingers and wrist emphasize the molding's profile on the lower right. Articulation joins many straight pieces into a structure that itself is capable of curvature. That is to say, Moroni's version of pictorial composition, binding things together so that they can move but also snap out of place. Linked to the body is the wall, open to the sky. Exposed to the elements, it shows signs of wear and weathering. And these converge with the poet's face and body. Calligraphic cracks in the stone approach the bravura of script. Alluding perhaps to the poet's febrile mind, the clefts point to the sitter's eyes and upper skull. Water stains along the pilaster follow the length of his trunk. They stream down from the cracks next to his eyes like falling tears, or else like the blood flowing down the central arteries along the length of the body. The jagged edges of the bricks mirror the poet's profile, its high forehead and prominent nose. This wall refers to architecture that juxtaposes brickwork with plain pilasters, perhaps constructed from a local gray stone such as macigno. The pairing of stone revetment over brick is widespread in mid-16th century architecture, especially on the facades of northern Italian churches. And one such example, an example I owe to my colleague and friend Mike Waters at Columbia, one such example is the funerary chapel known in Milan as the Mausoleo Trivulzio, designed by Bramantino in 1512. Its facade pairs stone pilasters in Tuscan order against brick. And in the Portrait of the Poet, Moroni's pairing of brick and ashlar stone presents a type of architecture in decay. As Marvin Trachtenberg has taught us, Renaissance architects were keenly aware that their buildings were subject to tempus edax, devouring time, the teeth of transience. Alberti himself frequently commented on buildings' vulnerability to the elements. He described how walls might fall apart, how their bones might be broken, as he put it. Alberti also said that stone, like wood, could split and warp, containing unseen abscesses and pockets of decayed matter, which eventually swell up. Weathering turns architectural exteriors, which we often take as exemplars of solid immutability, into their opposite, places of constant mutability. As David Leatherbarrow has observed, wind and weather erase one surface and expose another concealed in the depths of a building's structure. There's an irony to weathering, because when buildings weather, their fragmentary nature recalls the process of their being built, brick by brick. And in the Portrait of a Poet, the kinetic property of weathering has affective force. It suggests the exposure of inner deposits, not material deposits, but emotional ones too. The poet has, in fact, at his side, books that contend with the mutability of love and friendship. And on the spine of the one he holds in his hand, on the upper right, we can make out the word affetti, passions. Barely visible at the bottom edge of the picture, behind the flap of the poet's cloak, the book has been identified as a 16th century commentary on Galen's treatise of knowing the passions, among them anger, greed, and gluttony. The ruined architecture may refer to instability and the unbridled energy of the soul that the ancient physician describes. But the poet's stoic expression, by contrast, exhibits the mastery of those passions. And yet, it appears that the poet is concealing the book, namely his passions, hiding them behind his cloak. These books might all be about affetti, about passions, but we're not reading them. We're looking at a picture where just a few words manage to appear. So yes, the passions are mastered in this portrait, but the wall behind him suggests that there are seeping abscesses inside that are hiding and lurking. I'd like now to turn to the last portrait I'll discuss this evening, the portrait of the Bergamasque nobleman Gian Girolamo Grumelli, also known as the Man in Pink. And I'm still formulating my ideas on this portrait, but for now I'd like to point out three of this magnificent work's distinctive qualities. First, its coloring. Second, the interest in decay. And third, the sword as a type of pivot between figure on one hand and ground on the other. So first, color. Warm pink and cool gray recur on a micro and macro level in the picture, intertwining body and building. Pilasters of gray stone project from the elevation of pinkish bricks. And joining and fusing the bricks are layers of gray mortar paste. Meanwhile, delicate silver thread delineates the stems, leaves, and flowers which course throughout Grumelli's magnificent pink silk costume. Italian Renaissance authors used the verb arrossire, literally to redden, arrossire, to describe this change of states, to describe the ripening of figs, to describe the inflaming of passion, or to describe blushing and embarrassment. This type of reddening, arrossire, seems to be in progress in Grumelli's face. For the flush in his cheeks rises from his pink jacket through the vessels of the stems of the plants embroidered on it. Like the man with the raised eyebrow, Grumelli's body is caught at the moment of a reflex action between sensation on one hand and its bodily response on the other. Now, Grumelli's flushed face could allude to his marriage. The festivities took place the year after the portrait was completed in 1561. Another possible reference are the beadwork knots on his garters. It's interesting to note that to tie the knot appears in Romeo and Juliet a bit later, but in fact it was in use as an expression in ancient languages long before. And here the knot, a type of soft joint, literally ties pink and gray together. It's interesting to note that the motif of pink and gray shows the contrast between cold stone and warm flesh. We might think of the flashes of pink in the ground as moments when stone blushes. Moreover, this motif resonates with landmarks in the cities where Moroni lived and worked. In Bergamo, these would include the baptistry and Bartolomeo Colleoni's commemorative chapel. And in Brescia, the Monte Vecchio di Pietà, Santa Maria di Miracoli, or the Mausoleo Martinengo. These monuments all exhibit the same chromatic motif using sandstone, limestone, and marble extracted from quarries relatively nearby. Many of these monuments are memorials, as if the pink keeps the flesh of the commemorated individual fresh in the mind. We might therefore ask ourselves whether a city has a local color or colors, whether a city has a distinctive palette for its people and buildings. Ancient architectural theorists defined the city in terms of two concepts. The first was urbs, the built environment, and the second was civitas, the citizens who lived inside a city's houses, the citizens who worshipped in its churches, the citizens who were protected within its walls. The pink and gray characters in Moroni's paintings seem to incarnate the city's chromatic scheme, seeming to be built from the same stones. Looking at the characteristic buildings of Bergamo, we might notice how pink and gray alternate in bands and grids. The banding or checkering of these two colors in figure and ground and in between them occurs in a more pronounced way in Moroni than in other paintings of the period in which pink and gray figure prominently. What I want to say is that pink and gray, painting and architecture, body and building interlock. They work together to imagine a shared political existence, a shared political existence arising between the walls of the city that is in and of itself colored by its particular location. As in heraldry and coats of arms, the colors of the landscape are abstracted to form a symbol that represents a place. In other words, identity could be theorized as being grounded, a product of geography, a product of deep geology. But we need to ask ourselves, is the self ever anchored, however deep the quarries beneath its feet? The distinctive mark of the figured self, I've argued, is its containment by the wall. But in Grimelli's portrait, the figure's containment is adamantly contingent. He stands against a scene of decay. The pilasters and wall are chipped and stained. The niche is crumbling away, overgrown with plants. A lone foot remains of what was once a heroic sculpture, a sculpture whose torso has now tumbled to the ground below. The ground itself has cracked and is accumulating clouds of dust. As Nicolas Suter has called it, form can emerge from formlessness. Or as Francesco Borgo has termed it, dust calls attention to the artist's imaginative impetus. The portrait, in other words, dramatizes the idea of transition, the passage between different states of being. As the catalog itself mentions, the relief reflects on this concern with transition in terms of succession. Here we see a key episode in the life of the prophet Elijah and his follower Elisha. The second book of Kings recounts, and I quote, "Behold, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven." Moroni here depicts Elijah in his chariot, surrounded by a pinwheel of billowing flames. And I think you can make out the portrait of Elijah and his flowing beard to the upper right. He confers the mantle to the left, the mantle, the symbol of prophetic succession, to his follower Elisha, who kneels below. The motto on the relief also contends with succession. Like Gabriel's, it's written in Spanish, attesting to the close ties between Bergamo and Spanish-controlled Milan. It reads, "Más el casero que el primero." The last is better than the first. Más el casero que el primero. Now, in modern Spanish, casero would be pronounced zaguero, spelled with a Z. Nowadays in Spanish, it refers to defenders on a soccer team. So for those of you who follow La Liga, this would be Gerard Piqué or Sergio Ramos, for those of you who are following the Champions League as we speak. But let's go back to medieval Europe. In medieval Spanish, zaguero refers to soldiers who took up the rear flank. And so this caption might then mean he who follows is better than he who leads. Scholars have indeed interpreted the motto and relief as commentaries on the sitter's life. Grumelli was the second, not the first husband of Isotta Brambati, the woman he married in 1561, the year following the portrait's completion. Moroni painted Isotta herself at least twice, and on the right, I show you the earliest of the portraits completed at least 10 years before in 1550. On this view, then, he would then be the erotic victor to Isotta's first husband. As the first ones fall, the followers rise. How does this transition operate in the organization of figure and ground? Grumelli's sword makes an explicit connection between the monochromatic relief and his vibrant costume. The flames surrounding Elijah's chariot imply red. One might imagine then that the sword conveys the red flames from the colorless relief. This gets transferred to Grumelli's costume with its florid ornament and codpiece framed by his hands, where the coursing of blood in the veins is visible. His cheeks, in turn, inflame, underscoring the triumph of youthful vigor. Grumelli was in his early 20s at the time of the portrait's completion. Figure, in other words, draws on ground for its vitality. Seen from another perspective, however, Grumelli's sword cuts across the illusionistic relief, right above Elisha's hand before he catches Elijah's mantle. The diagonal splits the scene, causing the transfer of prophetic office to exist in a state of indefinite suspension. Elisha then will forever be awaiting the prophet's cloak, perpetually hanging in the air above. This might seem to call Grumelli's identity as successor into question, but we could look at this interpretation in yet another way. For while Grumelli is surrounded by signs of decay, for him at least, the aging process has been arrested. The gray wall encloses him, yet its ruined state shows that this containment can only be temporary. The sword is an instrument that puts a pause in this transience. The sword cuts through it. We might think of the Italian expression ritagliare del tempo, or a ritaglio del tempo, literally meaning to cut out or carve time out for yourself. Finally, we might ask ourselves, what happens when Grumelli takes a step, drawing his sword away from the relief? At that point, the prophetic succession will be underway. Elisha will continue Elijah's miraculous deeds. The knot has been tied. And as time consumes him, Grumelli himself will eventually resemble the statue in the empty niche, the contours of the body only intimated by the network of ivy or the cut of an empty costume. At that point, Grumelli's body itself will be a fragment of itself, like the torso sitting on the ground. He will resemble the dust that surrounds his feet, those sediments of time that Monika Wagner has described as the ultimate entropic material. At that point, then, Grumelli will become what painting always was since its inception, that evening long ago in ancient Corinth, when a shadow of a beloved about to depart was cast against a gray ground. The wall on that view is not just background. It becomes a monument, a place that contains the figure, yet points at the same time to the inevitable contingency of life. Thank you very much.